I believe that every question has an answer. That if you look for an answer to a question, you can find it. I truly believe that. Sometimes the answer is simple. You ask, you investigate, you confirm. The problem resolves. But some questions don't yield like that. They don't sit still long enough to be solved directly. They widen, they multiply. Each answer opens another layer beneath it. You start by looking for a fact, and you end up staring at a structure. That belief is what pulled me in when David Grush came forward. At first, it was a simple question. What's in our skies? But once you start asking that question honestly, it doesn't stay small. Each answer creates more questions. Craft becomes retrieval. Retrieval becomes secrecy. Secrecy becomes history. History becomes religion. Religion becomes consciousness. And suddenly, you're not just asking, what's flying above us? You're asking, what reality is doing around us? And that's when I realized I'd crossed a line most people don't see when they first step over it. There's a point where the question stops being about aircraft, governments, or classified programs. It stops being about hardware at all. When the inquiry keeps widening like that, when it begins touching history, myth, religion, psychology, and the structure of reality itself, you're no longer investigating an object. You're investigating a pattern that spans domains. That pattern, I learned, is what many people refer to as the phenomenon. Not just unidentified aircraft, not just contact reports, but the entire cross-cultural, cross-historical cluster of anomalies that refuses to stay in one category. Once I understood that, the sky was no longer the center of the question. The pattern was. I'm a generalist, and if I have a special skill, it's listening. Real listening. The kind that stays patient when there are 10 explanations for the same thing, and everyone is yelling with certainty. In the world we live in now, that's very difficult. My other skill is making connections. I've cultivated it my whole life because I've always been obsessed with learning widely, not just deeply. I trained as a writer in college, learning how to build worlds and characters, and track logic that makes a story hold together. I fell hard into futurism because I wanted to understand what tomorrow might look like and what forces shape it. I studied psychology because human behavior is the engine behind almost everything. I learned to cook because it taught me a deeper kind of synthesis. Not just flavors that get bound, cultures, memory. It's people at a table who might otherwise never meet. If you understand the relationships, you can take things that seem unrelated and make them speak the same language. So no, I'm not a specialist in any one of these fields. I'm a generalist. And as a chef, I enjoy being a generalist. In kitchens, the people who can do a little of everything are often the ones who keep the whole machine alive. Outside the kitchen, jack of all trades gets used like an insult. I'm not saying this to inflate myself. I'm saying it because I don't think the phenomenon can be understood through a single lens. It shows up in too many forms across too many domains. If you want to see the shape of it, you have to be willing to look through many windows at once. And that's what I've unknowingly trained myself to do my whole life. That's the lens I bring here. I don't treat contradictions as reasons to stop. I treat them as signals that the frame is too small. And I kept widening the frame until a deeper shape started to reveal itself. I kept digging because I couldn't shake the feeling that all of these threads were connected. If every question has an answer, then there's a root question underneath the rest. The one everything keeps orbiting, even when people don't realize it. So I followed the questions until they collapsed into one. What is the phenomenon? Hi, I'm Jordan, and I believe I've put together a compelling unifying theory of the phenomenon. I'm not writing this as a career scientist or a professor. I'm writing it as someone who couldn't stop following a thread. For years, I've been learning across futurism, mythology, history, consciousness research, UFO and contact literature, anthropology, and physics-adjacent work, among other things. This paper is my attempt to connect those dots into one framework. It's speculative, but it's written seriously. Think of it as a proposal, a way of looking at the world that you can test against your own experience, and that specialists can stress test with better tools than I have. So, what am I calling the phenomenon? The phenomenon is a long-running cross-cultural cluster of anomalies that shows up as both physical events and consciousness-linked experiences. People report unidentified aerial events and other strange manifestations, along mental and perceptual effects, telepathy and psychic abilities, synchronicities, altered states, missing time, reality inconsistencies, and encounters with non-human and other than human intelligences. This is an umbrella term because the reports keep pointing to one underlying process that can present as technology, intelligence, or environmental weirdness. And it behaves like it reacts to observers. In plain terms, different people touch different edges of the same thing. So what falls under the phenomenon? Reports commonly associated with the phenomenon include psychic abilities and consciousness effects, things like telepathy, intuition spikes, out-of-body experiences, mediumship, and energy healing. Synchronicity clusters, such as repeating numbers, symbolic animal sightings, stacked confirmations from unrelated sources, UAP and high strangeness physics, such as lights, orbs, plasma-like activity, impossible flight of strange craft, electromagnetic effects, reality inconsistencies, Mandela effects, timeline weirdness, impossible coincidences, missing time and abduction-style encounters, beings described as greys, mantis types, Nordics, and other entities, hotspot geography, places like Skinwalker Ranch, and the hitchhiker effect where contact follows people home, deep history anomalies, ancient civilizations seeming more advanced than we're taught, flood myths, and recurring civilizing figures, religious and mythic layers, angels, demons, Jesus Christ, revelation experiences, contact framed as spiritual warfare or salvation. This list sounds chaotic, doesn't it? The surface forms vary wildly, but the pattern underneath feels connected. Here's the central issue. Witnesses are not only reporting different phenomena, they're reporting different rules. It's as if the phenomenon doesn't operate like a normal object in a normal world. It adapts. It mirrors. It provokes. It teaches. It frightens. It comforts. It stages scenes. It bends memory. It bends belief. That's why the phenomenon is hard to pin down. It doesn't behave like a single thing. It behaves like a relationship. So what is the phenomenon? My working hypothesis is that the core of the phenomenon is humanity. Yeah, humanity. To be more clear, it's humanity interacting with reality through consciousness across space-time and across branching realities. Humanity isn't just observing the universe. We're entangled with it. As above, so below. As within, so without. The phenomenon is what that entanglement looks like when it becomes obvious and begins to produce shared effects. To explain why the phenomenon behaves so strangely, we have to talk about time. I don't see time as a flat line. I see the present as a moving point advancing forward, while the past and future swirl around it in loops, pressures, and feedback. The present doesn't just follow the past, it negotiates with it. The future doesn't just arrive, it reaches back. A symbol that captures this best is the caduceus. Dual snakes, which act as currents spiraling around a central staff, which is the axis, ascending into the wings, ascending upwards. The staff with the wings atop represents the present always ascending, while the snakes represent the relationship of the past and the future to the present. The caduceus represents duality and ascension, but it also fits a model where reality is shaped by opposing flows braided around the now. I don't believe there's a model out there for time that quite matches this, so let's refer to it as caduceus time. If that model is true, then the phenomenon is what happens on a mass scale when those braided currents become strong enough to be perceived, measured, or experienced. Let's begin by talking about the present. The present, as far as perception can measure, appears to move forward, yet time is experienced subjectively. Attention, stress, memory, and expectation can compress or dilate our sense of duration. That alone is enough to show that time, as lived, is not identical across observers. Subjective time doesn't prove objective reality differs, but it proves the observer is not a neutral instrument. If the observer varies, then it's at least possible that what gets stabilized varies too. And if our experience of time can diverge while the clock remains constant, it raises a larger possibility that our experience of reality can diverge too, even when we believe we're witnessing the same event. If you look at a water bottle sitting on a table, each person is seeing it through their own version of the present. The bottle you experience is shaped by your attention, your angle, your memory, your expectations, even your nervous system in that moment. Someone else is seeing a version that's extremely close, but not identical. And yet we still agree there's a single water bottle there, because beneath our subjective versions is an objective anchor in the room. And our perceptions overlap closely enough to lock onto the same shared object we both call the water bottle. That sounds small until you scale it, because now imagine billions of us doing that, constantly, with everything. Reality becomes a negotiated space. That's why Mandela effects hit the way they do. Or why you and a friend can remember the same night differently, down to the details you bet money on. Which version really happened? In this framework, both happened. And you're arguing across two slightly different timelines that got stitched into the same conversation. In this framework, the conflict isn't about who's right. It can be what happens when two near identical timelines produce different but convincing memories that get stitched into the same conversation. Both people feel certain because in their stream, they're remembering something real. So the natural question is, where's the evidence that the present could work like that? If the present is fixed and deterministic, then timeline stitching is just a metaphor. But if the present is probabilistic, then stitching becomes a mechanism. Small differences can exist, selection can occur, and convergence can produce a shared result without everyone carrying the same history into it. That's why manifestation matters here. If manifestation is real, it probably doesn't look like cartoon sorcery. It looks like probability. It looks like a pathway. Most of what we call the present feels solid because at human scale, reality behaves with consistency. But underneath that stability is a deeper truth we already accept in physics. Many outcomes are best described as likelihoods until an outcome is finalized. The world is not a chain of certainties. It's a field of options with weighted odds. There's an unusual body of research that suggests those odds may be slightly steerable. Researchers have repeatedly tested whether human intention correlates with the output of random physical systems, especially random number generators. One of the clearest summaries is a peer-reviewed meta-analysis by Dean Radin and Roger Nelson in Foundations of Physics, which was written in 1989. It reviewed over 800 experiments and found that control conditions behaved as expected, while experimental conditions showed small but statistically reliable deviations from chance. Imagine a machine is basically rolling a perfectly fair coin between 0 and 1, which would be heads or tails, but we're going to use numbers to describe this. In the control condition, where no one was trying for a specific outcome, you'd expect 1 to show up about 50 times out of 100. Now put a person there who's trying to will the number 1 to appear. The effect reported is that 1 shows up 50.016 times out of 100, instead of what would be expected at exactly 50. That difference is tiny per 100 trials, but across millions of trials, it becomes a clear statistical bump compared to the control. That sounds microscopic until you realize what it means in practice. Across millions of trials, a microscopic bias becomes a visible surplus, not a miracle, a nudge. So what does that imply? The conventional interpretation in this research is micropsychokinesis. Intention produces a small but measurable bias in the statistical output of random physical systems. In other words, they're changing the outcome of the random number generator with their minds. I accept the result at face value. Where I differ is the mechanism. My interpretation is more radical and, to me, more coherent with the broader pattern in this paper. We're not pushing a machine to change. We're selecting a branch of reality in which the machine already produced the desired outcome. I'm saying we're shifting through realities. While the conventional micropsychokinesis view sees consciousness as applying a subtle force, the branch selection lens avoids implying that stronger intention should yield bigger physical effects, which aligns better with why macro PK remains unreplicable, and everyday manifestation shows up as heightened luck or chains of plausible coincidence rather than law-breaking miracles. The distinction matters most outside the lab. One predicts hidden energies we never find. The other expects exactly the pattern synchronicities and glitches we actually observe. In other words, the present behaves like a probability service. Intention does not violate law. It biases selection. And if that's true in a controlled lab context, it's probably true in everyday life too, because we live inside the same probabilistic present. We're doing it constantly, usually unconsciously, with outcomes that look like coincidence, luck, synchronicity, timing, or fate. This also explains why collective perception matters. If you put 10 people in the same anomalous experience, and you rarely get 10 identical reports, you get noise, disagreement, and distortion, but you also get recurring overlaps, a shared silhouette. In a probability model, that's exactly what you'd expect. Perception samples from a field of near possibles, and overlap is the signal. To be clear, this area is contested. Later meta-analyses still report small effects, while critics argue selective reporting and other biases could account for them. But if even a fraction of the effect is real, the implication is enormous. Reality is not a fixed track. It's a responsive selection process, and consciousness may be part of the steering mechanism. You can see the same principle in remote viewing. Put 10 remote viewers on the same target, and you rarely get 10 identical descriptions. You get noise, contradictions, and fragments, but you also get a shared silhouette, a few consistent shapes, textures, functions, or locations that repeat across independent viewers. In this framework, that pattern makes sense. They aren't seeing a fixed photograph of the future. They're sampling a probability field. Each viewer increases the odds of pulling the correct features, and the overlap is what rises above the noise. So when I make a choice, I'm not just turning left or right. I'm stepping into a version of reality where that choice is already true. The problem is, we're all doing it at once. Billions of micro branches colliding. That collision is what people experience as chaos, contradictions, and glitches. Now, let's discuss the past. One way the past shows up is obvious. Discoveries that keep expanding our timeline and forcing rewrites of what ancient even means. Whether it's new layers at Göbekli Tepe, or fresh claims about hidden structures beneath the pyramids. Another way is subtler. The growing sense that our story about human origins and capabilities is under pressure to change. The deeper version is this: the past may not be fully locked. It may behave less like a sealed vault and more like a living archive, where what we notice, recover, and reinterpret keeps reshaping the present. And if the past isn't fully sealed, then lost advanced civilizations and recurring cataclysm cycles stop sounding like pure fantasy and start looking like a pattern trying to reassert itself. I want to push further back into the past, because this is where the idea of one human story starts breaking down. In the Western frame, the origin story of humanity begins with Adam and Eve. Creation happens, the fall happens, generations pass, and then humanity is reset by the Great Flood. Noah and his family survive in the ark and restart civilization. But when you widen the lens, you find multiple origin templates across cultures that rhyme in structure, even when the characters and symbols differ. The trick is that some traditions emphasize a first pair, while others emphasize a restart pair after catastrophe. Both function as an Adam and Eve rule in the narrative, even if they occur at different points in the timeline. Let's talk about one of the many stories of the first pair. We'll go over the story of Ask and Embla, which originates in Norse mythology. In the early days, when the world is still raw around the edges, 3 gods walk the shoreline and find 2 pieces of driftwood washed up like unfinished shapes. They stop. They look closer. They decide the beach is going to be a birthplace. In the telling, the trio of gods are Odin, Hörnir, and Lothur. Odin gives breath and life. Hörnir gives mind and awareness. Lothur gives warmth, color, and the senses that make a body feel like a body. 2 lengths of wood become a man and a woman. Ask and Embla. Humanity begins as something made, shaped by intention, not merely stumbled into. There's also many resets. Let's take a look at Plato's Atlantis story. In Critias, Atlantis begins as an ordered, God-founded civilization, tied to Poseidon and governed by inherited law. For a long stretch, they're described as disciplined and clear-sighted, valuing virtue over wealth. Then the turning point, their divine portion fades. The human appetite takes over, and they become visibly debased, full of avarice and unrighteous power. Zeus sees the corruption and calls the gods together to punish and correct them. The reset itself is delivered in Timaeus. Violent earthquakes and floods strike, and in a single day and night of misfortune, the island of Atlantis disappears into the sea. When a civilization reaches a point where power outgrows restraint, the system does not merely decline, it reboots. Sometimes there's a warning. Not every flood story is a total erasure. In some versions of the reset, something intervenes before the wipe is complete. A warning's given. A boundary is drawn. A remnant is preserved. The destruction still happens, but continuity is carried through it. In the flood episode of the Epic of Gilgamesh, the gods decide to end humanity with a deluge, but Enki breaks the silence. He finds a way to warn Utnapishtim without openly defying the decision, instructing him to dismantle his old life and build a sealed vessel. Utnapishtim obeys. He constructs the craft, stocks it with life and provisions, brings his household inside, and shuts the world out. Then the flood arrives with full force. The land disappears underwater. The ordinary world is overwritten. When the water finally recedes, the vessel comes to rest, and Utnapishtim confirms the reset is ending by releasing birds into the air, testing whether the world can hold life again. Afterward, he offers sacrifice, and the story closes its loop. Almost everything is gone, but not everything is lost. The reset is not only destruction, it's also selection, a warning, a vessel, a surviving thread. Next, civilization restarts. In the Dogon telling, the teacher after the reset is Noma, an amphibious, fish-like ancestral being, explicitly described as the teacher, or master of the water. After disorder enters the world through Yurugu, the creator, Amma, moves to restore order by sending a structured beginning down to earth. An ark made of pure earth is lowered from the heavens by a copper chain, and it strikes the ground at the first rainfall. When the first pool of water forms, the sun rises for the first time in that same moment. Nomo goes to live in the pool, where the first ancestors settle where they landed and use the earth from the ark to make the first cultivated field. At first, these ancestors are not civilized in any recognizable sense. They communicate with cries and grunts. This is where Nomo's teacher role becomes explicit. Nomo teaches them language, and he teaches it alongside weaving, as if speech and craft are twin technologies that turn a group into a society. From there, the curriculum expands. He reveals the foundational techniques that make settled life possible, including agriculture, blacksmithing, dance, and music. The account frames this as the moment the first human society is founded, with marriage and social structure following as part of the same ordering process. So you can see there's a repeating skeleton. Different cultures, different names, different symbols, but the structure keeps resurfacing. 1. The origin story. 2. The reset. 3. Knowledge returns and civilization restarts. 4. The cycle repeats. That's not a random coincidence. It's a recurring pattern. Most people recognize it in the biblical frame, but the same sequence appears in many places in full form. Here's one clear and full example. In the recorded Endian creation cycle, Viracocha begins in a world described as dark, before the ordering light of the sun. From that darkness, he produces a first race that is too large, giants. In one commonly cited version, he makes them by sculpting immense figures out of stone and then animating them by giving them breath and life, as if the world's first people were literal statues brought into motion. That first creation fails. Different accounts give different reasons: rebellion, disorder, or simply that they are the wrong kind of beings. But the narrative logic is consistent. Viracocha rejects the first draft. Some tellings describe him returning parts of this first creation to stone, and then initiating a full reset through a catastrophic flood. In Sarmiento's version, the deluge is described as an overwhelming rain lasting 60 days and 60 nights, drowning what had been created. After the purge, the myth turns toward a second beginning. Viracocha brings order and light, often by establishing the sun, moon, and stars in post-contact summaries, then creates humanity again on a smaller human scale. One version frames this as a second act of making beings from stone, now smaller and more suitable. Another teaching summary describes him forming people as figures, giving them their languages and customs, and assigning them places to emerge into the world, as though humanity is redistributed into a newly structured reality. The structure is explicit: an initial creation, a failure or corruption, a wipeout, and a second beginning. Now zoom out from the story and look at the ancient stone structures around the world. If we look at the ancient monuments around the world, such as the pyramids and Stonehenge, among many others, it seems evident they were created with a level of precision and knowledge that feels impossible today, at least with the story we tell ourselves about the past. And when you step back and compare these monuments across continents, it can look like one ancient civilization built them all, because of the similarities in geometry, alignment, scale, obsession with stone, and the similar messages they convey in their writings and art. But I propose it wasn't one. I propose it was many. That humanity has many origins. That different branches of humanity rose in different places under different circumstances, carrying different myth structures, different knowledge, different languages, different relationships to the sky and the earth, and yet they echo each other. Sometimes that echo is convergence, similar minds solving similar problems under the same sky. And sometimes it's inheritance, because worlds that begin separately can still later collide, trade, conquer, teach, and spread a shared architectural logic across continents. It seems that each civilization had its own Atlantis-like story: a height of power or knowledge, a rupture, a reset, and then a rebuilding. An imprint left on humanity, cycling again and again, like a pattern that refuses to die. Some origin stories don't even stay on Earth. Some point to other planets: Mars, Venus, the Pleiades. Some describe underworld civilizations coming out of ground. Others describe arrival through other dimensions, or crossings from places we'd call myth, only because we don't have the vocabulary for them. Regardless of how you interpret those claims, here's what I'm focused on: the pattern of how we're learning about the past and the order it seems to be arriving in. And I do believe we're learning about the past in a specific order. Across archaeology, geopolitics, and religion, we're watching different chapters of the past come into focus at the same time. Göbekli Tepe and the pyramids push on the official timeline as we dig deeper into the ground. The 20th century keeps sprouting unanswered questions, including what was really driving figures like Hitler and the strange scientific and historical research he was conducting. And the spiritual foundation is under pressure too, as people re-examine what the story of Jesus Christ actually was. And here's another one. What really happened with JFK? I'm not claiming these revelations arrive one after another in a neat order. I'm saying they're unfolding in parallel, and that the combined effect feels like a single story rounding itself out in the present. And as the present keeps moving forward, we're going to keep learning more about these separate pasts. And the pace has recently begun accelerating. What used to take generations now shifts in years, months, sometimes in even days. What used to feel buried now surfaces. If that acceleration continues, it points toward a singularity, a moment when the pressure of these histories becomes too strong to ignore, and the old single timeline story breaks open. If this is true, I want you to take a moment to think about what this all means. When you look around your office, the coffee shop you order from, the neighbor you see every week, even your spouse, you may be looking at someone whose ancestry comes from a different stream than yours. Not just a different family tree, but a different root line, a different origin thread that ran separately for a long time and then converged into the same present. In this framework, humanity is not a single straight line, it's a braid. Multiple beginnings, multiple resets, multiple survivals, and then a convergence so complete we mistake it for one continuous story. I'm suggesting this goes beyond simple evolution as we usually talk about it. The separation would not be obvious on the surface, which is exactly why we miss it. It would be buried in deep lineage and deep history compressed into one shared narrative by time, catastrophe, and assimilation. The result is a world where two people can live side by side, speak the same language, share the same culture, even build a life together, while carrying different origin histories under the hood. I'm challenging the simplified single-track account of human origins as incomplete. In this framework, there may have been multiple human adjacent lineages, discontinuities, and convergences, a layered ancestry that got braided into what we now call us. I suspect the world became more stable when long-separated populations began contacting each other across continents. In this model, that is not only cultural exchange, it's reality compression. Multiple streams that had been running in parallel begin to overlap. Different origin stories, different gods, different calendars, different maps of what matter, different assumptions about what is obviously true. The merge is not gentle, it's confusing, destabilizing, and often violent, because the conflict is not just over resources, it's over which world is real. When two civilizations collide, people do not only fight about land, they fight about legitimacy, morality, cosmology, and memory. They fight about who was chosen, who was first, who owns the sacred story, whose law is lawful, whose history counts, whose gods are gods, whose names are true. In this framework, wars can be understood as more than conquest. They're attempts to force coherence. A dominant group does not merely defeat another, it imposes a baseline, language, measurement, law, ritual, identity, and the official version of the past. That enforcement can be brutal, but it produces what every large system eventually demands, a shared operating reality. Over time, that compression creates a seal. Not perfect, not total, but stable enough to feel normal. The contradictions do not vanish, they get managed. Some get absorbed through synthesis and hybridization. Some get buried. Some become folklore. Some become impossible and therefore unspeakable. But the overall effect is narrowing of acceptable reality into a common channel, a shared baseline most people can inhabit without constant fracture. The point is not that everyone becomes identical. The point is that the world becomes coherent enough to function. In this model, modern instability is what you would expect when the seal starts thinning again. More contact, faster exchange, more competing narratives, more branches colliding at once. The system seeks stability, but the convergence is accelerating, and acceleration produces heat. Now, let's discuss the future. In this framework, the future is not an empty space where we eventually arrive at. It's an active pressure on the present, the same way the past is. The present is the surface where multiple timelines meet, but the future is the direction those timelines are trying to stabilize into. When enough observers commit to a trajectory, that trajectory becomes heavier. It pulls probability toward itself. Choices do not simply create outcomes, they select which branch becomes the dominant corridor. And because the branches are not fully sealed, information and influence can leak across them, especially at the seams. High emotion, high significance, high anomaly. So far, I've been describing the past as braided, multiple origins, multiple resets, converging into one lived present. But if that's true, the braid doesn't stop at now. It continues forward. The future becomes another set of branches, and some of those branches can collide with us early, the way the past collides with us through memory and mismatch. And once you accept that, the idea of contact changes category. It stops looking like random visitors are coming from somewhere else and becomes a collision between timeline branches. If some contact cases involve entities that behave like future humans, then abduction reports take on a different meaning. They aren't random invaders. They're quite possibly family. They're survival mechanisms. They're self-preservation reaching backward through time. And if the future isn't set, then interacting with us now could be a way of stabilizing their own existence. That also fits the repeated theme of interest around nuclear technology. If we wipe ourselves out, entire branches of the future never happen. In that frame, interference isn't conquest, it's triage. This might also explain why the tech in UAPs seems to change with the era. The phenomenon wears masks that match the time. Airships, fairies, angels, saucers, triangles. Same theater, different costumes. Even the technology inside the crafts seems to update with the decade. In the 80s, the tech people described looked bulkier. Now it looks cleaner, smaller, more modern. These craft may literally be from dimensions where the technology appears this way. And it may explain why there are many types of grays. Not one species, but many branches, many outcomes, many timelines, many agendas. If you had a family tree that grew sideways through reality, you wouldn't get one version of us, you'd get a swarm of cousins. I believe as the future approaches the present in its own singularity, it branches out in infinite directions. Some branches fall, some rise, but it also seems that there's evidence that many have made it through what we call the Fermi paradox, especially if you look at it through this lens. And that's actually good news. It means there's a chance the cataclysm cycle doesn't repeat this time, because there may be versions of us that are frankly selfishly protecting humanity from destroying itself. Not saints, not saviors, just survivors guarding their very own livelihood. Which leads to a reframing. What we've been calling non-human intelligence may very well include humanity in many different forms. In fact, calling it non-human intelligence may be purposely misleading us down the wrong path. I propose we call that category divergent human intelligences, DHI. It leaves room for humans from different timelines or dimensions, and it also leaves room for overlaps, where multiple branches can intersect in the same world we currently live in. So, what should divergent human intelligence look like? If my theory is even partially true, then non-human intelligence is an overly blunt category. Some of what we may call NHI may actually be humanity in divergent form. Humans from other timelines, other branches, other environments, or other domains of reality that can still overlap with ours. That's what I mean by divergent human intelligences, DHI. And if DHI is real, then we should expect something specific. Other intelligences won't be completely alien. They should share recognizable traits with us because they're either related to us, derived from us, or close enough in origin that the same biological blueprint keeps showing through. What would that imply biologically? If DHI is a valid frame, then they should show evidence of human-adjacent physiology, bilateral symmetry, a familiar skeletal layout, recognizable organ logic like lungs, heart analogs, sensory systems that map onto our reality in ways we can interpret, genetic kinship, not necessarily identical DNA as we know it, but either shared genetic architecture, shared molecular patterns, or some kind of biochemical compatibility that suggests common ancestry or engineered compatibility, developmental similarity, pregnancy-like development, growth stages, hormonal regulation, and other life cycle features that mirror the human pattern, even if the details differ. In short, if there are relatives across branches, they shouldn't look like cosmic jellyfish every time. They should look like cousins. Strange cousins, sure, but cousins. This is where the hybrid idea becomes relevant. If multiple branches of human-like intelligences are interacting, then hybridization stops being a peripheral claim and becomes a logical consequence. Not because it's scandalous, because it's practical. Hybridization would be one of the cleanest ways to increase compatibility between timeline branches, stabilize long-term interaction, preserve a lineage under threat, or seed traits that help a branch survive its own bottlenecks. If they are divergent humans, then mixing isn't about invasion, it's about continuity, a tree grafting a branch to keep the orchard alive. This is what we should look for if this is true. If DHI is real, then the data should eventually tilt in a certain direction. For example, 1. Consistent human-like constraints, things like injuries, vulnerabilities, medical logic, and physical limitations that feel biological, not magical. 2. Anatomical convergence, repeated reports of familiar body plans, not infinite randomness. 3. Genetic and reproductive themes, recurring focus on heredity, lineage, survival, and biological continuity. 4. Variation that looks like branching, types that feel like evolutionary outcomes, engineered lineages, or timeline divergent cousins rather than a single uniform species, compatibility behaviors, an apparent interest in acclimation, adaptation, and integration rather than pure observation. One of the biggest mistakes we keep making is treating anomalous bodies and anomalous DNA like they only have two options: human or alien. That binary is exactly what my DHI model challenges. If divergent human intelligences exist, then some of the most controversial non-human cases might not be non-human at all. They might be human adjacent, meaning related to us, compatible with us, or branching from us in ways that still preserve recognizable biology. And if that's true, then the question isn't, is it extraterrestrial? The question is, what kind of human is it? What branch? What lineage? What overlap? Let's take a look at Bigfoot. If even a slice of the reported genetics is authentic, it becomes one of the cleanest examples of what I mean by hybrid, as a structural possibility rather than a carnival word. In the Sasquatch Genome Project claims associated with Melba Ketchum, the mitochondrial signal is described as human in origin, specifically modern human women. And the write-up reports 16 human mtDNA haplotypes, with the majority described as European or Middle Eastern in origin. At the same time, the same claim set argues that the nuclear picture is not simply human, but a hybrid cross involving an unknown primate, with human sequence interspersed in the genome. That combination is the point. Human maternal lineages on one side, and something that does not resolve cleanly inside standard classification on the other. In a DHI framework, that is exactly the kind of result you would expect if lineages can mix across branches, and exactly the same kind of data that gets misread when the only permitted categories are human or not human. The genetics claim is one layer. The other layer is the one people dismiss as circumstantial, not because it's non-existent, but because it doesn't fit a clean box, or so they say. You have physical trace evidence, especially footprints and track casts, collected, compared, and archived over decades, treated as data by the people who take the subject seriously. You have visual material, a long-running body of photos and footage anchored by a handful of famous cases that have survived as reference points for half a century. You have a witness corpus, thousands of reports collected into searchable databases, which means the signal is not just a story, it's a pattern set with recurring details across time and geography. And you even have audio, including recordings like the Sierra sounds that are presented as extended vocal sequences, described by believers as language-like, and treated as analyzable material rather than a single scream in the woods. My point is not that any one of these proves Bigfoot, although it's looking pretty convincing if you ask me. My point is that if you force all of this into only two categories, human or non-human, then you guarantee misinterpretation. In a DHI framework, the correct read is different. This is what it looks like when you're observing something human adjacent, hybridized, or taxonomy breaking through tools and assumptions that were never built to classify it. The Nazca mummies are where the old binary breaks hardest, human or alien. Because what makes them unsettling is not that they look like Hollywood extraterrestrials, it's that they look like something that shares the logic of biology, but not the template we're used to calling human. If DHI is real, this is exactly the kind of case that would confuse everyone. A divergent branch of humanity or a human-adjacent lineage could still carry human-like biological signatures, while expressing radically different morphology. Human signals wouldn't automatically debunk it, they'd be expected. And that's why the hybrid question matters here. In the DHI model, hybridization isn't a sci-fi kink, it's a practical outcome of overlap. If branches interact, if lineages cross, if timelines braid, then you'd expect mixed signals. Not a clean non-human genome, not a clean modern human baseline, but something that looks like inheritance under pressure. What makes the Nazca case especially interesting through this lens is that the people studying and presenting these bodies claim multiple forms of analysis. Things like imaging, morphology, carbon dating, DNA work, and they explicitly point to sequencing data being made available for other researchers to examine. If the Nazca mummies are DHI, here's what we should expect. If these remains represent a divergent human intelligence rather than aliens, the evidence should tend to look like this. Human-adjacent core signatures, enough overlap that human shows up in testing, because it's still the same family tree. Non-baseline expression, traits that don't sit comfortably inside our current idea of the human range. Branch variation, more than one type, because divergence produces families, not a single uniform species. Hybrid-like patterns, signals that look mixed, conflicted, or mosaic, consistent with lineages crossing or being engineered for compatibility. Coherent anatomy, systems that look integrated, not like a crude assembly job, because a real lineage grows like a tree. It doesn't get glued together like a prop. So the reframing is simple. The Nazca mummies may not be aliens. They may be a different version of humanity, farther out on the spectrum, so different looking that our culture can only interpret it as fraud or extraterrestrial. But if the DHI hypothesis is true, that's exactly the mistake we'd keep making until we finally admit there's a third category, divergent human. I'm using this to highlight a pattern. When we see something that doesn't fit the official story, we label it alien too fast, and we label it fake too fast. DHI offers a third lane. It may be related to us, and we've been misreading it because we've been trained to think reality only has one trunk and one timeline. This is more than a vocabulary swap. It changes how we interpret intent. If DHI exists, then at least some encounters are not human versus aliens. They're humanity encountering itself across branches, under conditions of pressure, secrecy, and survival. And that would mean that the phenomenon is not simply contact with the unknown. It's contact with our own expanded family tree. If the past and future are both pressing into the present, then reality isn't best represented as a straight line. It's better represented as a living organism, a sacred tree of life. In this model, Earth is the tree, and humanity is the nervous system running through it. We're not outside observers staring at the tree from a distance. We're inside it. We're part of the structure that's growing, splitting, remembering, and choosing. The past isn't just behind us. It behaves more like a root system, sprawling, branching, interwoven, still feeding the present. That's why ancient history doesn't stay settled. New layers are found, old narratives fracture, flood myths recur, civilizer figures reappear under different names, and the deeper we dig, the more it feels like we aren't uncovering one past, but many pasts braided together. Roots don't exist to be admired, they exist to supply the trunk. In this framework, what we call the past is still active, still pressurized, still pushing nutrient and information upward into the now. The trunk is the present. It's the only place where all pressures become experience. And it's not a solitary trunk. It's a trunk made of billions of minds, constantly forming a shared world from slightly different angles. That's why disagreement isn't just social, it might be structural. Two people can remember the same event differently, not because one is lying, but because they're pulling from slightly different root streams that still feed the same now. This is also why glitches appear. If reality is being co-authored in real time by billions of observers, then the present is a negotiation zone. Most of the time it stabilizes. Sometimes it stutters, sometimes it leaks. The future is the canopy, many branches coming out of the top. This is what choice architecture looks like in living form. Every decision is a slight tilt toward one branch. Some branches thicken into stable timelines. Some split again. Some die off. Some become so different they look like entirely different species of outcome. If contact narratives sometimes involve future humans or intelligences behaving like preservation mechanisms, then the branches aren't just growing forward. They're also sending signals backward, pruning, steering, trying to keep the tree alive long enough for the branch to exist. Where are we in this model? We're the middle. We are the meeting point between the roots of what has been and the branches of what could be. That's what makes humanity unique in this frame. Not morally superior, but structurally central. We are where reality becomes self-aware enough to influence its own growth. The phenomenon, then, is not random. It's what it looks like when the tree becomes conscious of itself, and the flow becomes visible. Synchronicities, contact, memory distortions, timeline pressure, mythic recurrence, sudden bursts of ancient data, and the sense of acceleration. Many people sense escalation. If past and future are pressing harder into the present, the experience would feel like an exponential curve going vertical. Synchronicity stacking, disclosure pressure rising, ancient history reopening, contact narratives intensifying, and the veil thinning. In this model, human beings are central. Earth functions as a nexus because the human layer matters to how timelines converge and stabilize. The present is a meeting point, and our collective observation and decision-making influence which branches become dominant. Rate of convergence is accelerating. I believe we've already crossed the event horizon of a human singularity. A convergence built out of information, intelligence, and attention. A point where the past and the future start pressing into the present so hard that normal history stops feeling linear and starts feeling like a compression. An event horizon is the threshold where the trajectory becomes effectively irreversible. You can still debate what you're looking at, but you can't go back to the old pace. The old assumptions, the old baseline. The tempo has shifted. The rate of novelty, disclosure, reinterpretation, and technological acceleration has begun to climb in a way that doesn't feel incremental. It feels exponential. And the strangest part is how it comes from both directions at once. The past is accelerating toward us. We're not just learning more history, we're watching the category of history expand. Archaeology keeps producing timeline pressure, the kind of finds that don't just add details but force a rewrite. At the same time, the modern era is being relitigated in real time. Classified programs, hidden networks, suppressed research trips, and reinterpretations of pivotal figures and events. Religious history is also under pressure, not as a purely spiritual question, but as a question of what actually happened and what got encoded into myth. It's not that one of these is first and the others are later, it's that they're unfolding in parallel, and the pace of that parallel unfolding has started to increase. The future is accelerating toward us. On the other side, we're building systems that reach forward. AI is already a prediction engine, a pattern extractor, a simulator of outcomes. Quantum computing is still early, but the direction is obvious. More compute, more modeling, more capacity to explore solution spaces that human intuition can't traverse in a lifetime. This is why I think the singularity I'm describing isn't a cosmic endpoint, it's an intelligence endpoint. A moment where our tools become powerful enough to collapse uncertainty at scale. Not just about the future, but about the past. Not because we become omniscient, but because we become capable of reconstructing, simulating, and cross-validating reality from more angles than any previous civilization would. Ray Kurzweil's well-known 2045 technological singularity timeline is one cultural reference point for this kind of convergence, whether or not someone agrees with his confidence. If my model is right and we're moving toward a convergence point, then the speed at which AI grows towards superintelligence is one of the clearest, most measurable signs of how steep the exponential has become. In simple terms, watch the AI curve, and you can estimate where we are on the larger curve. My guess is that something peaks around 2040 to 2045. Quantum physicists have a model similar to my singularity theory called the Big Crunch. In cosmology, the Big Crunch is the hypothesis of the universe eventually reversing expansion after the Big Bang reaches full expansion and recollapsing back to a single point. My caveat is that I'm not claiming the universe is ending. I'm saying humanity itself is undergoing a convergence event that resembles a crunch in terms of space-time and how we experience it. Past and future compressing into the present, until a new phase becomes unavoidable. So what happens as we spiral into the center of the singularity? The closer we get to the convergence point, the more it will feel like we're gaining traction on an exponential curve. At first, that traction will be confusing. It'll look like chaos, glitches, and destabilization, because the probabilistic world feels unstable when you're starting to influence it. But over time, a different pattern emerges: control, mastery, a growing ability to steer outcomes, not perfectly at first, but increasingly. In this framework, manifestation becomes more and more immediate as we approach the center, until it feels instantaneous. Not because we're breaking physics, but because we're learning to navigate selection in real time. I believe there's a very good example out there. I'd like to use the Christopher Nolan film Interstellar as a useful metaphor. It gives us a partial idea of what we can expect on the other side. The days on Earth will still be 24 hours. The clock will still tick, but our grasp of time will change. The present becomes something we can orient within. The future becomes something we can reach into. The past becomes something we can recover and integrate. Reality stops feeling like a single track and starts feeling like a space you can move through. We will be creators, able to manifest reality at will. And the journey to that point will be different for every single person on Earth. We are the caterpillar in the cocoon right now, because we've crossed the event horizon. And at the end of this process, we don't just get smarter. We change form. We become the butterfly. We evolve into our fully interdimensional selves, capable of operating inside a reality that is no longer passive, no longer fixed, but responsive to consciousness, choice, and collective intention. I do believe this framework is testable, and I want it tested. What matters is whether the theory generates consistent, falsifiable predictions across disciplines: psychology, physics, history, neuroscience, data science, and field investigation. If reality behaves more like branching structure than a single line, then we should expect measurable patterns: clustering, coupling between observation and anomaly, error-dependent masks with stable underlying structure, and signals of convergence as pressure builds toward a singularity. If this model is wrong, it should fail under disciplined measurement. If it's right, it should produce repeatable signatures that don't depend on belief. I'm presenting a framework and its predictions, not a finished science program. The point is to give investigators something coherent to try to break. If I'm right, the rate of manifestation is accelerating. We shouldn't have to wait 20 years to see it. And the experiment to find out if I'm right is actually very simple. A few years should be enough, if even that long. Because in this model, the curve is getting steeper over time, and we're already in it. All we need to do is run a random number generator intention test continuously, log everything, and compare the results in time blocks, like every month or every quarter. The key question is simple: does the above chance bump stay flat? Or does it grow as time passes? If we really are inside the singularity, the bump shouldn't just repeat at roughly plus 0.016% forever. It should start climbing faster and faster, and that rising pattern should become visible within a relatively short window. If this can be measured in a lab, then it isn't just a philosophy, it's a mechanism. And that mechanism would show up outside the lab too, in the places where the phenomenon starts acting like it's keyed to a person instead of a place. So, this is my unified theory on the phenomenon. When the hitchhiker effect follows someone home, when it stops being tied to a location and starts behaving like it's attached to a person, I'm suggesting it's happening because we are the phenomenon. When reality becomes inconsistent, Mandela effects show up, memories don't match, and synchronicities stack with a precision that feels engineered. I'm suggesting it's happening because we are the phenomena. When the sky fills with orbs and impossible motion, and when people report missing time and abduction-style encounters in the middle of the night, I'm suggesting it's happening because we are the phenomena. And when the deep past repeats the same structure across cultures, cataclysms, resets,
and teachers return to start civilization, I'm suggesting it's happening because we are the phenomenon. And if that's true, the stakes change. If multiple futures exist, and contact narratives include both cooperative and hostile elements, we're not dealing with a single storyline. We're dealing with a choice of architecture. Some futures look dystopian, and some look luminous. So the point is not to worship or fear any one faction, but to recognize agency. We're being shown possible paths, and we might be selecting among them through individual and collective behavior and consciousness. What I'm saying is the phenomenon's not out there. It's what we are. It's what we were. And it's what we're becoming.